So with apologies for the delay, we needed to try and sort out the availability of some documents for display in the hearing room. And the first document is PRSE 304252. This is one of Professor Cash's statements to the Penrose inquiry, and this is concerned with knowledge of and involvement in issues relating to AIDS and HIV, in particular in 1983. If we go to the second page, bottom of the page, the passage in bold print, number 2, actually predates the issue of AIDS by a number of years, but is worth looking at. Professor Cash says, as I recall, the first public warning in the UK concerning the potential dangers of commercial concentrates came from the SNBTS, and he refers to the BMJ article in January 1976. I quote, there is no doubt that the import into the UK of factor VIII concentrates derived from external sources, however well screened for viruses, represents an unequivocal pathway by which the level of a potentially lethal virus into the whole community is being deliberately increased. That's what we looked at earlier.
So he's quoting himself? He's
quoting himself, yes. He then refers to what he says were similar SNBTS exhortations at a later stage.
And he's claiming to be the first public warning when one might have thought that just a few days before there'd been the public warning given by Grenada.
Well, quite, yes, sir.
Anyway, there we are.
He then, top of the next page, deals with the meeting in January 1983, which we've looked at, and says this, I believe it may be relevant to emphasise that it was myself on behalf of the SNBTS directors who ensured that the topic of HIV/AIDS was discussed at the joint meeting with the SHS HCDs on the 21st of January 1983. I'm quite certain that the minute note of this item does not reflect the extent of the discussions which took place, nor the sense of dark foreboding, which was further expressed in June 1983 at the SNBTS Factor VIII Safety Subcommittee. So there is, as it were, an amplification of about the mood of the meeting, which obviously one doesn't get from the bare words of the minutes.
Difficult to see, actually, how a minute note on the 21st of January could reflect a sense of dark foreboding 6 months later.
Well, I think he's suggesting, as I read it, he's suggesting that there was already a sense of dark foreboding at that January 1983 meeting.
It must be what he means, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense.
Yes. In other words, a sense that there was something potentially very, very problematic, very serious here indeed. And that then found further expression at the meeting later that year. It is how I've read that passage. But it is what it is.
Was Dr. Han at that meeting, by any chance?
The 21st of January meeting?
Yes.
Let me double check. It's PRSC 301736. No, he was not.
Yes, thanks.
If we just go back and look briefly at those minutes in light of Professor Cash's observations. So the attendees are there listed. So we have Dr. Bell from SSHD, we have Dr. Cash, and then we have various haemophilia centre directors. So we've got, for example, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Ludlam. We've got regional transfusion director representatives, for example, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. McClelland. We've got Mr. Watt of the PFC. Not at that stage, Dr. Han. And then the passage that we looked at, and which Professor Cash is then commenting on, is at page 7, where so it's 6A, where it refers to drawing attention to recent articles, and Dr. Ludlam referring to what was being done in the UK. So as I read it, Professor Cash is saying that doesn't capture the unsurprisingly perhaps in a setup, and it's the real mood of the meeting.
And if you would just go back for a moment to 4252, that's PRIC 330s 4252.
Page 3.
I think we may find there the answer to my own question in the opening words of paragraph 4. I just as we left the screen,
Yes.
I noticed that.
Yes,
So that makes it clear what he meant.
It does. It should also be added that this dark foreboding in January 1983 must have been shared by the UKHC clinical teams. Then if we go further down this page to paragraph 6, he says this: during the preparation for the joint meeting on the 13th of January 1983, I think that must be 21st of January, but I don't think it matters one way or another, I had asked Dr. Bell, the meeting chairman, whether the CMO, Chief Medical Officer Scotland, might be prepared to issue a letter to health boards, prescribing physicians and patient interest groups, drawing attention to the increased risk of virus infections in patients receiving commercial plasma products, and advising that whenever possible, the safer SNBTS products should be preferred. I should add that I don't take much credit for generating this proposal. It emerged as a consequence of my contact with the European colleagues who were advising their governments in a consultation process by the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers on the prevention of the possible transmission of AIDS from affected blood donors to patients receiving blood or blood products. Dr. Bell requested my proposal was not included in the meeting briefing paper, but advised he would discuss it with the CMO, Dr. John Reid. By the time the meeting took place on the 13th of January 1983, Dr. Bell had not yet spoken to the CMO, but during the meeting he commented thus: the chairman stressed that, in terms of national policy, the purchase of commercial products should be avoided so far as possible. Some weeks later, Dr. Bell advised me that he had spoken to the CMO and my proposal did not enjoy the CMO's support. So evidence there that at the outset of January 1983, there was a specific proposal put forward to the Scottish Chief Medical Officer for sending some form of guidance or letter within Scotland, which was rejected. That's what Professor Cash is saying. He then continues as follows: in the early summer of 1983, I put my proposal to the CMO in his office. By that time, I was able to remind the CMO that the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers had adopted recommendations, and those are the recommendations we've looked at now on multiple occasions, sir, which included a recommendation of governments to inform attending physicians and selected recipients, such as haemophiliacs, of the potential hazards of haemotherapy and the possibilities of minimising these risks. Dr. Reid advised that my proposal would not enjoy the support of DHSS and was therefore unacceptable to him and his administrative colleagues. I have to confess, this was one of the darkest days of my tenure as National Medical Director and contributed greatly to subsequent events, which included my resignation as SHHD advisor in blood transfusion. There followed a number of acrimonious and distressing exchanges on this topic, which went on until the 5th of September 1987, on the occasion of the annual scientific meeting of the British Blood Transfusion Society meeting in Stirling. I don't, sir, I'm afraid, have details of what happened at that latter meeting in 1987. So those are Professor Cash's recollections of interactions either directly with or through the CMO or with the CMO through the intervention of Dr. Bell. The other issue dealt with in this statement is the question of Dr. Spence Galbraith's 9th of May 1983 letter. Professor Cash was asked about that. And if we go to the next page, we can see there's reference in the third paragraph. It says, Dr. Galbraith of the PHLS specifically recommended on the 9th of May 1983 that blood products from the USA should cease to be used. I should say, this is part of the question to Dr. Cash, Professor Cash. This is not his answer. And then there's a quote from the letter. And then the question continues, there must have been knowledge in Scotland of this recommendation from Dr. Galbraith. It was referred to at the English Directors' Meeting of the 18th of May 1983, which was attended by Dr. Ruth Mitchell. He prepared a note of the meeting, which must have been circulated with an SMBTS, and that's an issue we'll need to pick up on later occasions. A question mark, presumably it was sent to Dr. Cash, whose apologies were tendered at the meeting, and then the questions posed, was there ever any thinking along these lines in Scotland? If we go further down the page to the bold and underlined answer, Professor Cash says this: I regret I'm unable to recall whether we discussed Dr. Galbraith's proposal contained in a letter to DHSS dated 9th of May 1983 to ban the importation of all commercial factor concentrates from the USA. I have been advised that there is no evidence available from records of SNBTS directors' meetings which demonstrates that either I and or the SNBTS directors were ever briefed by either Dr. Gunson or SHHD officials on Dr. Galbraith's proposals. Dr. Mitchell's note makes no mention of Dr. Galbraith or the impending deliberations of the CSM subcommittee. So that's Professor Cash's recollection in relation to the Galbraith letter. And you'll recall, sir, from the evidence we've heard from haemophilia clinicians, that that's a recollection shared by the majority of haemophilia clinicians, that they too were unaware of this recommendation. If we then just turn finally in this document to page 9, I think it is, Shomek. And sorry, let me pick it up at the bottom of the previous page so we can see the question which Professor Cash is answering. So bottom of the page, the question is this: by the early part of 1984, there appears to have been caution in Scotland in relation to the use of commercial products from abroad, but small amounts of commercial products were still purchased. Why was this necessary? We also need to ascertain what happened in practice with the use of heated concentrates in Scotland in 1984. When were physicians able to begin using heat-treated commercial concentrates? If that's the question, Professor Cash's first response is to suggest that the questions are also directed to the relevant clinicians. And then he says this: from an SNBTS perspective, there appeared at this time to be a major concern throughout UK haemophilia centres that despite all the political exhortation supporting clinical freedom, at some time in the future, the haemophilia centre directors might be forced by government to rely exclusively on NHS products. For those clinicians who'd practiced in the early 1970s, this perceived threat was a cause of considerable concern. NHS products were viewed by many HCDs as intrinsically unreliable, both in terms of supply and quality of product. Moreover, unlike their commercial counterparts, NHS products were manufactured under the aegis of Crown immunity, which was viewed in some clinical quarters as an opportunity for inferior manufacturing practices. Hence, I believed that even in Scotland, there was a view that it was unwise to rely too heavily on an NHS supply monopoly, but rather to retain some sort of the marketplace. And then paragraph 5, I'd reason to believe that this view, Floriat Res Marketplace, enjoyed the support of some health board officials in Edinburgh and Glasgow and officials in SHHD, notably the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, Dr. Graham Calder. It follows that the notion that the continued importation into Scotland of commercial coagulation factor concentrates in the early 1980s was solely promoted by the SHS, the Scottish Health Service, haemophilia centre directors under the guise of clinical freedom is, in my view, simplistic and misleading. It was part of what was viewed as an emerging government-inspired NHS marketplace culture. So those are Professor Cash's reflections upon what he thought might have been some of the thinking of others, both within haemophilia centres and within the Scottish Health Boards and Scottish Home and Health Department. If we pick up then issues relating to developments on AIDS by reference to the contemporaneous documents, PRSE 00039111, please. This was a letter from Professor Cash to Dr. Bell of the Scottish Home and Health Department, 15th of February 1984. refers to a meeting of the SNBTS earlier that month. And he then says, I've been asked to convey to the department the views of SNBTS directors on this matter. They can be viewed, summarised as follows. 1, that there should be formed a single UK group responsible to the Departments of Health for coordinating research in the area covering the interface between blood transfusion and AIDS. This group should have representatives of existing smaller groups already in existence, haematologists and haemophilia centre directors, and of the SNBTS directors. And then he identifies what he says are the major areas requiring attention: prospective study in homosexual males and to control blood donor population, prospective clinical study to determine value of existing tests in transmitting AIDS, and then studies on autotransfusion, small pool factor 8 and physically treated factor 8. So that's the position being conveyed to Dr. Bellers at February 1984. The next key development in 1984 as regards developing knowledge of what was happening in relation to AIDS was, of course, the discovery that a number of patients had been infected or were testing positive for HDLV3, having been treated with PFC products. And obviously we've explored that issue with Professor Ludlam in the course of his oral evidence. If we just pick up Professor Cash's own involvement, and I'm not going to go through the full history, but we can see his involvement at PRSC 40828. This is a memo from Dr. McClelland of SNBTS to Dr. Perry, copied to Professor Cash. It's dated the 20th of November 1984, and it's concerned with events leading up to the recall of Factor 8 batch 023110090. And we can see paragraph 1 records Dr. Ludlam telephoning Dr. McClelland to inform him that 6 of his patients had developed antibodies to HTLV3. That was the evening of the 26th of October. We can then see that that was notified almost immediately to Professor Cash. So paragraph 2 tells us that Dr. McClelland contacted Professor Cash on the 27th of October, the following morning, and discussed this information with him. We were both agreed, so that's McClelland and Cash, that the information was insufficient to require any recall of PFC products. There's then reference to discussion between Dr. Ludlam and Dr. Bolton in paragraph 3, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Bolton in the next few weeks when he gives oral evidence. And then we can see from the end of paragraph 3 that it was again concluded that the data did not at this time justify a formal recall of any batch. There's then reference to further information being provided by Dr. Ludlam to Dr. McClelland on the 2nd of November, 15 or 16 patients having received this particular batch. And then we can see the recall decision communicated and described in paragraph 5. The date of October the 3rd is obviously wrong, November the 3rd. Dr. Bolton and I personally contacted all the Scottish transfusion centres and Northern Ireland Transfusion Centre and informed a senior member of staff that the above batch should be immediately recalled. So Dr. Cash had some involvement. Whether he had involvement in the subsequent discussions there recorded is not clear, but he appears to have been party to the initial decision not to recall the PFC products on the 27th of October. I'm not proposing to go to it, but there is a letter from Dr. McClelland to Dr. Cash on the 15th of November 1984. The reference for the transcript is LOTH 605_052, which sets out the position as at that date. There is then a meeting of the SNBTS on the 11th of December, chaired by Professor Cash, PRSE 301767. You'll see the list of attendees there, and that Professor Cash was in the chair. If we go first of all to page 4, we can pick up the narrative in relation to that particular batch in the third paragraph on the page, headed Factor 8 batch 023110090. Dr. Cash recalled the decision taken at the coordinating group meeting on the 20th of November to quarantine the plasma from subsequent donations by donors who had contributed to the suspect pool and to discard the red cells, platelets, etc. It had transpired that discarding cells would cause considerable shortage in some regions, particularly over Christmas and New Year, and it had therefore been relaxed. The final decision on the matter would lie with individual directors. So that would suggest a modification of the original decision, which was to discard everything prepared from donations by donors who contributed to the suspect pool. And that was modified in relation to red cells because of shortages or potential shortage in some regions. And it was said that that would be a matter for individual director discretion. It then says all the plasma had been identified and notified to the transfusion centres who would continue to keep the donor sample. And there is further discussion in relation to that. This letter also records Dr. Cash's view about the need for a coordinated UK approach to transfusion and AIDS, and we can pick that up at the bottom of the previous page. So bottom of page 3, last 2 paragraphs. There's reference there to the advice of the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, which again we've looked at in earlier hearings. And then the last paragraph reads, Dr. Cash said he would make further representations to the SHHD that there should be a more effectively coordinated UK approach to transfusion and AIDS. This had already been recommended by the Scottish directors. The directors noted with regret that a second meeting of this working group on AIDS had not been arranged. And we go then to the top of the next page. It's not entirely easy to read, but it looks like, and there appeared to be no evidence of coordination of the many splinter groups which existed. There is also discussion in this meeting of circulation of the AIDS leaflet, but I'll come on to the issue of the AIDS leaflet later in the course of the afternoon. So that's 11th of December 1984. I can't recall without checking whether Professor Cash had been present at the meeting at BPL on the 10th of December 1984. But he certainly contributed to the UK HCDO AIDS advisory document that was pulled together after that meeting. And we can see that from HCDO 40270_007. Again, we've looked at this on multiple occasions. AIDS advisory document at a recent meeting of reference centre directors, that's the 10th of December meeting at Elstree, the following observations were discussed and recommendations made in consultation with Doctors Richard Lane, John Cash, Harold Gunson, Philip Mortimer, Richard Tedder, John Crask and others. And just to pick up the picture in relation to Scotland over the page, top of the page records the probability that HTLV3 has been incorporated into at least one BPL and one Scottish batch of Factor 8. And then further down the page, just around halfway down, there's a heading Edinburgh, which records from now on all Scottish Factor 8 will be dry heated to supply Scotland into Northern Ireland. If we then just pick matters up in January of 1985 with PRSC 304386. we see a perhaps characteristically trenchant letter from Professor Cash to Dr Bell at the Scottish Home and Health Department, 24th of January. First paragraph, the inevitable delay in my discussion with the Chief Medical Officer means that there may be the occasional topic which I must draw to the attention of departmental colleagues earlier than I had anticipated. The matter to which I refer below arises as a result of recent meetings of both the SNBTS and NBTS directors. And then he picks up on the issue of what was happening in terms of introducing testing for donations, blood donations for HTLV3. So he says, I've been seriously concerned by reports I've received from those who attended the meeting of the Working Group on AIDS to consider the implications for the National Blood Transfusion Service of testing blood donations for antibody to HTLV3. This meeting, from the standpoint of those left with the actual responsibility of running the UK transfusion services, was wholly inadequate. None of the really important matters which will affect policy were appropriately discussed. And more importantly, no arrangements were made for the creation of subgroups to examine some of the many major problems. Nor even was a date set for any further meeting. The SNBTS director representative, the chairman of the NBTS directors meeting and the DHSS advisor on blood transfusion have all reported to me that they remain completely in the dark. The next paragraph
That's a reference, is it, to a meeting which took place in November 1984?
Yes, I think that's right, sir. I don't think it can be, it's not a reference to the meeting of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, which was January 1985.
I think it's...
So I think it must be a reference to the November 84 meeting, yes.
And that would be, what, the 20th of November, is it, am I right? Or 24th, I can't remember.
That sounds right, but I'm afraid without checking.
Sometime about then, anyway. And I think the note of the meeting begins with the fact that there was unanimous view that testing should be urgently introduced.
Yes. I'm not sure whether we've got the meeting available to display.
I'm afraid I haven't got my notes of references with me, so I can't simply give it to you.
Sorry, let me just check, sir, whether we have it available this afternoon. If not, I can check overnight. Sorry, I'm not. There's a meeting on the 8th of November, but I don't think it's that. 27th of November.
27th.
But according to the minutes of a meeting that took place on the 8th of November, so the advisory committee on the NBTS met on the 8th of November 84. Have got that available today, but it says that screening was one of the points to be considered by the working group on the 27th of November.
So that will be this meeting.
I'm fairly sure that's right, sir. We'll have it available for tomorrow so that we can double check. So then Professor Cash continues by saying, at a meeting of the SNBTS directors on the 7th of February 84, 11 months ago, the whole question of AIDS in the transfusion services was discussed after the directors had studied a report prepared by Dr. McClelland at their request. It was concluded that it would be inappropriate for the SNBTS to go it alone, and there was an urgent need for this topic to be taken up as a UK joint departmental matter. I was asked to convey this conclusion to the SHHD as soon as possible. I did so in a letter to you dated the 15th of February 84. I know not whether these views were transmitted to the DHSS. Some 9 months later, a meeting was organised by DHSS. It was not a joint departmental one. The Scots were there as observers. The SHHD representative had no experience in transfusion matters, and there seems little doubt that it was, as far as we can judge at the present time, a waste of public money. Over the page, 2 months after this working group meeting, the DHSS advisor in blood transfusion, which is presumably a reference to Dr. Gunson, found himself unable to answer vital questions put to him by the NBTS directors meeting in Manchester 23rd of January 1985, and could say no more than he believed the chairman of the working group would be reporting back at the next meeting of the parent committee, DHSS NBTS Advisory Committee, on May the 23rd, 1985. The DHSS advisor was, however, able to report that the DHSS was about to release the new AIDS leaflet for blood donors with the recommendations on the ways they should be distributed, which would not be binding. I'm not sure that that is actually a reference to Dr. Gunson. I'll check the minutes again, sir. Then it says the NBTS directors then moved on to the topic of HTLV3 antibody testing. Richard Lane and Harold Gunson described the fiasco which emerged at DHSS on the 27th of November. Richard further described more recent events and announced that the CBLA had now written to the DHSS conveying its serious disquiet that the CBLA was deliberately excluded from a, quotation marks, secret meeting between DHSS officials, Professor Weiss, Dr. Tedder and Wellcome Diagnostics. The assembled directors listened to this in dismay and bemusement. The DHSS advisor insisted that he'd not been involved in development. And then there is a reference to antibody testing kits. So finally, news was brought to the NBTS directors that at least 3 foreign companies were actively involved in establishing proving trials for their 8-TLV3 antibody kits in UK transfusion centres. The purpose of these exercises is to provide data for FDA licences. Once these licences are released, the floodgates would open. The American companies wish to have the UK data by 31st of March. Some present NBTS directors expressed the view which Brian McClelland and I share, following information that we received from the US, that licences will be granted despite a possible 10 to 15% incidence of false positives. All these would require sophisticated Western blot check tests, and the problems created in the donor programs would be significant to say the least, and he refers to a publication in the Lancet. And then it goes back to some of the generic issues about coordination or lack of it. 3 lines down into that paragraph, after all this time, it is with dismay that I must conclude that there are just no mechanisms in the UK for these crucially important topics to be discussed openly and confidentially. Not quite sure what's meant by openly and confidentially.
I think he means the two separate processes.
Yes.
Part of it's open, part of it's confidential.
Maybe. And for clear, coordinated policies to emerge. The biggest anxiety of the NBTS directors with regard to this problem is the Scots, that they will unilaterally move to come in line with the American proposals. They're right. We are in detailed discussion with commercial kit companies. Our technical staff are already looking at ways of introducing the technology within existing staff establishments. We have the Western blot technique, HQ and SE labs. We are already liaising with local communicable disease physicians with a view to securing care for our positive donors, and we are currently arranging our financial planning accordingly. I advised the NBTS directors that we would do everything possible to avoid such a development. They were not impressed and cited our unilateral introduction of RIA-HBsAg testing, the issue of heat-treated factor VIII and our new AIDS donor leaflet. I have much sympathy with them, for I'm bound to reflect that everything possible isn't much when we're dealing with a non-existent management structure of a fragmented organisation led by the Department of Health, which, as far as I can see, in terms of this aspect of the NHS, is lost and floundering in an increasingly high profile. I write, therefore, once again to request that the SHHD pursues this matter into the UK arena. I'm doing my best to contain matters with my professional colleagues. The NBTS directors have agreed to hold an extra meeting on the 18th of February 1985. Judging from the discussions in Manchester, there is very likely to be a call to see the Minister, a view which I would at the present time support. The Minister is on record that all the AIDS work in the UK is being funded and directed by the MRC. When asked what direct contribution the DHSS was making, he directed the interviewer's attention to the money being invested in Elstree. I'm afraid that is just not good enough. So a number of issues being traversed there, a number of opinions being expressed, and they are, of course, Professor Cash's perspective, expressed, as I said, in what appear to be quite characteristically strong terms. We may need to unpick some of the issues in relation, in particular, to meetings in due course, but instructive at least to see what Professor Cash's concerns were about a lack of strategy or coordination in relation to response to the unfolding AIDS situation. On the 29th of January, so a few days after this letter, Professor Cash attended the first expert advisory group on AIDS meeting. I'm not proposing to go to that. Again, we've looked at it before, we'll no doubt look at it again. PRSC 302734 for the transcript. Now, some of the issues in relation to HIV testing I'll pick up shortly. Just want to turn to what might be loosely termed responses to risk or measures that might reduce risk and deal with a range of different topics here, which will include HIV screening, include donor selection and the issue of the AIDS leaflet. Before I deal with those issues, just want to go back to an article I've referred to but not taken you to, which was Professor Cash's article in the BMJ in 1976, September of 1976, at PRSC 0003425. The relevance for present purposes of showing you this article is obviously one of the measures for responding to the unfolding AIDS crisis might have been greater use of cryoprecipitate. This is an early article in which Professor Cash, Dr. Cash as he then was, together with Mary Spenceley, discuss various matters relating to cryoprecipitate. And also forewarn that there may be increased reliance upon commercial products. And we can see that from the second paragraph in the summary on the left-hand side, where they say, although cryoprecipitate is much harder to store and administer than AHF, its yield from plasma may be far greater and its cost far smaller. Unless the blood transfusion services receive increased amounts of money and reappraise their functions and operation, it seems likely that they will have to rely on increasingly on commercial and costly sources for the major plasma fractions. There's then a discussion about production on the right-hand side under the heading methods, where they describe patients with haemophilia having been managed with various products, including fresh frozen plasma, cryoprecipitate, and anti-haemophilic fraction. And the last sentence of that paragraph explains that the fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate are prepared in the regional transfusion centre, whereas AHF is produced by the protein fractionation centre in Edinburgh. And then if we go over the page, on the right-hand side, under the heading Concentrate Specifications, there's a very detailed discussion about the production of factor concentrates and the production of cryoprecipitate. If we pick it up, yes, in the third paragraph, it says, we recognise that the preparation of cryoprecipitate with an average 60% yield may be unusual. He sets that out in more detail in the paragraph above. But this can be achieved, providing the centre staff regard it as a high priority and appreciate that it's extremely cost-effective. And then he refers to the average factor VIII concentrate of single donation cryoprecipitate. Then, a few lines down, he says this: we appreciate that many colleagues in haemophilia centres consider that the modern developments surrounding on-demand treatment, in particular its implementation in the home, make the ready availability of AHF essential. Although we recognise that ideally such a policy is admirable, enough evidence shows that cryoprecipitate can be used successfully for home treatment. Should this be wholly unacceptable for certain patients, then recourse to hospitals and health centres peripheral to the regional haemophilia centres may prove satisfactory temporary alternatives. And if we go to the next page, pick it up in the top right-hand column. Third line, in the meantime, the blood transfusion services ought to look towards improving the quality of cryoprecipitate production and procedures for the procuring of bulk fresh plasma. And then if we could just look at the list of references, the source references for the statement that the evidence shows that cryoprecipitate can be used successfully for home treatment are footnotes 9 to 12. And we'll ensure that we track down, if we don't already have them, each of those. Sarah, as obviously the potential use of cryoprecipitate for home treatment is an important issue for the inquiry. So we've looked at a number of other developments under the broad heading of self-sufficiency in relation to what was actually happening in terms of cryoprecipitate use in Scotland. So I won't go back to those, but there are some early thoughts from Professor Cash in relation to use of cryo. I want to come next then under this broad heading of measures to reduce or respond to risk, to the question of high-risk donations, and in particular collection from prisons and borstalls. We can start by looking at PRSC 40193. Minutes of the directors' meeting held in SMBTS headquarters 29th of March 1983. We see that Professor Cash was in the chair. And if we turn to page 5, paragraph 7, blood collection in prisons and borstalls. Dr. Cash reported that the medicines inspector had commented adversely on the practice of collecting blood in prisons and borstal institutions, and he invited directors to comment on the practices in each region and to give their views on the medicine inspector's criticism. It was reported by all directors present that sessions were held in penal institutions in all regions, although Dr. Brooks and Dr. Abaniak intended to review the situation in their regions. It was not possible for the directors to agree on future policy, but it was agreed that Dr. Brooks, as the Scottish representative, should ask the Working Party on the selection and care of blood donors to consider this issue. In the meantime, Dr. Cash agreed to inform the Medicines Inspectorate of these SMBTS discussions and conclusions. So you'll see there a snapshot of the picture as at March of 1983, by which time, of course, AIDS is very much on the agenda, and hepatitis has been on the agenda for many years by this point in time. Blood still being collected from prisons and borstal institutions. If we can then look at Professor Cash's witness statement to the Penrose inquiry on this issue, PRSC 0004484, please show me. So you'll see the heading there is prison donations. In fact, the issue is wider than prison donations that he's being asked to address. If we just go a little further down the page, the issue in respect of which a statement is sought, hepatitis C, the acceptance of blood from higher risk donors, in particular prisoners and donors who had a history of jaundice and who were negative for hepatitis B when the existence of non-A, non-B hepatitis was known and its presence could not be excluded. I'm going to concentrate for present purposes on prison collection. If we go to the next page, we pick it up at paragraph 3, which is the second paragraph down. He was asked when the practice of collecting blood from penal institutions stopped in each region in Scotland. And then he sets out the information he'd been provided with by SNBTS in order to answer the Penrose inquiry's question, saying this: Dr. Anne Welsh, SMBTS, has kindly advised me that the following dates are the occasions of the last prison donor sessions: Aberdeen, 28th of July 1983, Belfast, 26th of October 1983, Dundee, 2nd of August 1983, Edinburgh, 7th of April 1980, Glasgow, the 25th of March 1984, Inverness, the 24th of February 1983. And then, in response to the question why the practice stopped, he says this: it may be helpful to acquire information from those regional centre directors who are still alive, but it can be assumed that it had much to do with the comments of the MCA inspectors, and we saw reference to that in the minutes of the meeting we looked at. Although this issue was not raised at the Glasgow, Inverness, Aberdeen or Northern Ireland inspections, the lively/heated discussions of the directors at their meeting on the 29th of March 1983, that's what we were just looking at, when no consensus was achieved, and subsequent regional reflections on ways of sustaining supplies without prison sessions. What is more certain, however, is that these dates do not derive from a national SNBTS director's management decision, because such decisions required consensus or an instruction from SHHD. Neither was forthcoming. What we did do, as did the MCS inspectors, was seek guidance from DHSS. None came. My father was a prison chaplain, and on several occasions I had visited HM Armley Prison. I judged the health of many paid donors seen by me in 1969 in plasma collection centres in Los Angeles was much worse than that of inmates of Leeds HM Prison in 1983. As I recall, the problem of drug addiction in UK prisons in 1983 was not the problem it is now. Whilst arguably not relevant, it may be worth pointing out that MCA inspectors did not seek to impose a ban on prison donors used by commercial plasma collection agencies in the US, which supply plasma for coagulation factor concentrates for the UK. It's my understanding that prison donors were not excluded in the US until 1990. And then in paragraph 5, he's asked about what consideration was given between 1975 and 1984 by SNBTS as to whether there was a higher risk of hepatitis and whether the practice of collecting blood from penal institutions should continue. And his answer is, as far as I can recall, this topic was not discussed by the SNBTS directors until the matter was raised by the medicines inspector in 1982. Furthermore, to the best of my recollection, the news on the 29th of March 1983 that Edinburgh had abandoned prison donor session in 1980 came as a complete surprise to me and all other SNBTS directors. The cessation of prison donor sessions in Edinburgh in 1980 isn't actually what's recorded in the minutes, but it is it is the information that was supplied to Professor Cash by SNBTS for the purpose of making this statement.
Yes, it's doubly surprising, possibly, that he wouldn't have heard of it because he'd stopped being the director of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland blood service in 1979.
Yes. Yes.
And so you would have expected, perhaps, that there may have been remained contact between him and it.
Yes, perhaps. And it may be that we'll be able to obtain further information about that from oral witnesses or indeed from other documents. But in any event, what he appears to be saying is that an enhanced risk of hepatitis from prisons and the consequent suggestion that one might stop taking prison donations doesn't seem to have been on the SNBTS agenda until the issue was expressly raised by the Medicines Inspectorate with them in the course of inspections of some of the centres in 1982, which then led to the meeting, which led to the discussion at the meeting in March 1983 that we've looked at, following which over the next few months, the various centres appear then to have stopped prison collections in Scotland. He then is asked whether the cessation of the practice of collecting blood from penal institutions led to any difficulties in maintaining a sufficient supply of blood in Scotland. There's none that I recall, but I would advise that each former living regional centre director should be consulted. Certainly, I am aware that on a number of occasions after 1983, surgical procedures were postponed due to blood shortages in the west of Scotland. SNBTS has access to documents which will confirm this. Whether these shortages had anything to do with abandoning prison donor session is not known to me, but it is worth pointing out that the annual blood collection figures per million of population in the West was significantly below all other regions in Scotland, throughout the 1980s. And then he was asked, bottom of the page, whether he was aware of evidence produced by the National Blood Transfusion Service for England and Wales around July 1974 that the incidence of hepatitis B in donors from prisons was approximately 5 times greater than the incidence in donations from the general public, and if so, what, if anything, he did in response to that. Top of the next page says, I cannot recall whether I was aware of this evidence or the published work from the West of Scotland BTS. It doesn't entirely make grammatical sense, but I don't think it matters. If it was discussed by the SNBTS directors, then I would imagine it would have been raised by Dr. John Wallace, RTD at West of Scotland in 1974-5, and by Dr. Mitchell in 1981-82. And then this, I must confess I do not recall having ever given the matter on prison donors any consideration until it was raised by the Medicines Inspectorate in 1982-3. He's then asked if he was aware of the letter dated the 6th of January 1975 by J. Garrett Allen to Dr. William Maycock, warning of the increased risk of hepatitis, including non-A, non-B hepatitis from the blood of prisoners. Answer, as far as I can recall, I was not aware of this letter and first discovered its existence when reading Douglas Starr's book in 2007. The next question asks him if he was aware of the letter of the 1st of May 1975 by Dr. Yellowlees, Sir Henry Yellowlees, the Chief Medical Officer for England and Wales, and whether he, Professor Cash, agreed with the advice contained in that letter, i.e. that it was not necessary to discontinue the collection of blood from prisons, provided that all donations were tested for hepatitis B using a sensitive test. His answer is, as far as I can recall, I was not aware of this communication, but SNBTS may have access to copies of directors' meetings which reveal the contrary. And then, bottom of the page, next question is why the SNBTS continued to collect blood from penal institutions following the Medicines Inspectorate's adverse comments on that practice in March/May 1982. Answer, as far as I recall, there were 4 reasons. 1, there was bemusement that no mention of this difficulty had been made in the MI reports for Aberdeen, Glasgow and Inverness. 2, there was a strong view that this could have significant adverse effects on red cell supplies at certain times of the year, notably in the West. 3, without SNBTS directors' consensus, there was no national management process for considering issues related to the location of blood collection sessions in the regions. Throughout the UK, this issue was strictly left to the RTDs and their teams, and the priority was maintenance of supply. This management practice and the operational priorities enjoyed SHHD/DOH support. 4, there was uncertainty at the time with regard to the locus of the medicines inspectors regarding donor session issues, a view shared by SHHD. So I should say, I am proposing to look at some aspects of Professor Cash's oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, but that'll be tomorrow morning. So some of these issues are further teased out. There is then a reference to, in the next question, the meeting at the National Institute for Biological Standards and Controls on the 9th of February 1984, where it said that Dr. McClellan said that certain policies have been adopted in Scotland to minimise the risk of transmission of infection. Professor Cash says, I've no recollection of this NIBSC meeting and therefore unable to comment whether the minute accurately reflects what Dr. McClellan said, and maybe we'll be able to ask Dr. McClellan about this, but certainly there was no SNBTS policy in place in February 1984 regarding prison blood donor sessions. And then if we go to the bottom of the next page, please. So bottom of page 6. So this now picks up the issue of donors with a history of jaundice or hepatitis. And the question is posed as whether the SNBTS accepted the recommendation in the second report of Dr. Maycock's advisory group on the testing for the presence of hepatitis B surface antigen. You'll recall from what we looked at this morning that Dr. Cash was part of the advisory group which produced the third report, but this predated his involvement. We go to the top of the next page. This is Professor Cash's response. I do not recall this topic being discussed by the SNBTS directors in 1975, but I do recall soon after I was appointed National Medical Director expressing my concern to Dr. Ed Harris, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, London, that the criteria for the selection of blood donors in the UK was left in the hands of junior DHSS civil servants who had little knowledge of blood transfusion practice, nor were in touch with international experts. It's not clear precisely what Professor Cash's point is there, with, I think, all due respect. I'll check whether that particular point is amplified in the oral evidence, but why he forms the view that this has been left in the hands of junior DHSS civil servants is not immediately apparent. He's asked a number of other questions which I think he's not able to give much by way of a substantive answer. So I don't think there's anything else in that statement which is likely to greatly assist you. Just then picking up the issue then in relation to donor selection and exclusion of high-risk donors in the context of the risk of AIDS. This leads to the question of the production of the AIDS leaflet. Perhaps if we start by looking at PRSC 0003620, these are the minutes of a meeting of the Blood Transfusion Service, that's the SNBTS, is coordinating group, 24th of May 1983, with Dr. Cash in the chair. If we go to page 5, please. We can see the heading AIDS halfway down the page. The heading donor selection and communication of donors, Dr. Mitchell reported that he'd introduced into the health questionnaire to donors a question inviting those who were worried about AIDS to consult the doctor at the session. It was understood that the AABB's advice, that's the American Association of Blood Banks, to blood banks in the USA was that individual donors should sign a statement to the effect that they'd read the literature and understood that certain groups of donors have been asked to refrain from donating. So just pausing there, so this is, as I said, May 1983. We know in terms of what was happening for the production of an AIDS leaflet in England and Wales was the various exchanges we've looked at with Dr. Wolford and the ministerial witnesses, which led to a leaflet being produced in September of 1983. So just to get that sense of the parallel developments within the DHSS and the England and Wales National Blood Transfusion Service. So we've got, as at May 1983, a different approach is being taken by regional transfusion services within Scotland. Dr. Mitchell introducing the question into the health questionnaire. The next paragraph says, Dr. Abaniak had decided after consideration not to do anything locally, his view being that once a donor had entered the session, it was too late to make an approach and the problem was minor in North East Scotland. Dr. McClelland had prepared a leaflet, which he tabled, which explained through questions and answers the background to the recent publicity and detailed those donors who should refrain from donating blood. He intended to consult some of the organisations representing the gay community through which his leaflet might be circulated. It might go also to VD clinics and possibly also to drug abuse centres. Now, the question of precisely what happened with the Scottish leaflets and the Scottish initiatives will be explored in more detail than I'm going to attempt today with individual witnesses or through further presentations. But I just want to alight upon certain meetings and communications to which Professor Cash was party. If we go to the bottom of the page, there's then a heading SNBTS publicity. Dr. Cash sought his colleagues' agreement to the issue of a general statement to the media to the effect that until appropriate markers had been developed, the SNBTS would not wish to have blood donations from certain individuals. It was reported that the directors of England and Wales had discussed the problem at their most recent regular meeting and had decided that publicity should be both local and national, the latter in the form of a press release plus nomination of a press officer from DHSS to maintain contact with the media. They had decided also to ask Dr. John Barbara to draft a leaflet for the information of donors to be made available in transfusion centres. This leaflet was to be ready by the 30th of June. It was agreed after discussion that Dr. Cash should contact Dr. Barbara for information about the proposed leaflet, after which he would arrange a meeting with colleagues from SHHD to discuss the possibility of a press statement for Scotland and the provision of information which the transfusion directors could use if they wished. Dr. Mitchell's donor questionnaire and Dr. McClelland's leaflet would be circulated and discussed at the meeting. In view of the time constraints, the directors agreed that deputies could attend if they themselves were unavailable. So that's how matters were discussed in May of 1983. We know then that in the intervening period, the leaflet produced over which the DHSS had some control or had some involvement was published in September of 1983. If we pick the matter up in December 1983 at PRSE 0003679, we have a letter from Dr. McClelland to Professor Cash. And as I say, in terms of everything that happened in the intervening period, we're likely to want to explore that with individual witnesses. But here is Dr. McClelland writing to Professor Cash at December of 83. Following our recent discussion at the directors' meeting, I thought you might like to look at the enclosed. And then he refers to 3 pieces of material. He says, as you know, we haven't sent the existing AIDS leaflet out to all donors until now because we don't have sufficient stock. And in any case, my own view is that the wording needs to be changed a bit before we send it out. As an interim measure, however, we have added a specific reference to AIDS to all the donor call-up letters, drawing attention to the leaflet and the availability of information from the BTS. We have added specific questions and a specific reference to AIDS and the availability of the leaflet and further information to the questionnaire, which is filled in and signed by all new and repeat donors. I enclose a copy of the new donor questionnaire. And then thirdly, Frank Bolton and I have personally briefed individually all the donor medical staff on how to respond to donor questions about AIDS using the enclosed briefing document. This document has also been made available to all other session staff and has been written in such a way that it's also quite suitable to be read by donors. I'm not going to go to them now because I think we'll pick this up with Dr. Bolton and or Dr. McClelland in due course. But the staff document for the transcript is PRSE 0001861. There is a version of the questionnaire. I'm not yet confident whether it's the version that's being referred to in Dr. McClelland's letter at PRSE 301302. And I don't at the moment have a reference for the addition to the donor call-up letters, but no doubt we can rectify that between now and when these issues are explored further with oral witnesses. There was a further leaflet produced by SNBTS in the course of 1984. Again, the precise timings and changes to wording, I think, is probably best explored with individual oral witnesses. But we can then look at a meeting on the 20th of November 1984 at SBTS 0002210. This is an SNBTS coordinating group meeting, 20th of November 84, chaired by Professor Cash. If we go to the next page, we see it's said under the heading AIDS, decisions taken at coordinating group meeting 20th of November 1984. Dr. Cash tabled a confidential letter addressed to each director. The contents were discussed and the following main points agreed. Declaration by blood donors, each transfusion centre to incorporate into the health questionnaire given to each donor at a session the following words: I have read the SNBTS AIDS leaflet, important message to blood donors, and confirm that to the best of my knowledge I'm not in one of the defined transfusion-related risk groups. Then the second heading is distribution of important message to blood donors. So this is the distribution of the SNBTS leaflet. The text of the above must be distributed as follows, either as the leaflet which is available or in another printed form. 1, with call-up letter. 2, at session to every donor who attends. 3, to the organisers of workplace and college/university sessions. 4, with the registration book to new donors. 5, to the home address of donors who, not having been called to a session, attend nevertheless. This would be after donation. Overall aim of the above is that as many donors as possible should have seen the message before attending a session. This practice would be continued until further notice, but would be reviewed in 12 months' time or before. And then supply of leaflets, each director to find out within 24 hours how many leaflets he/she needs. And to contact Ms Corrie, it was subsequently established that a large order could be obtained within 1 week. We see that between May of 1983, when the issue was discussed at that meeting, and matters were effectively being left to the discretion of individual directors as to what information they provided to donors and how they approached the question of high-risk donors. Between then and November of 1984, there is a significant change in the sense that by November 1984, there is a universal approach to be applied to all the Scottish centres. As I say, we'll pick that up in more detail, no doubt, with individual Scottish centre directors who had some involvement in this issue. So just 2 further documents, I think, on the issue of AIDS donor leaflets. We have in previous hearings focused very much, and for obvious reasons, on the position in relation to 1983, 84 through into 1985. But it's interesting to note that the question of whether the AIDS donor leaflet should be changed or strengthened still further continued to be an issue in the second half of the 1980s. And so we can see from CBLA 302345 this is now October 1986, and if we go to the bottom of the second page, we see the heading AIDS donor leaflet. And there is discussion there about whether specific risk groups should be identified or not in those leaflets. I'm not going to read through the detail, but if we go to the top of the next page, we can see there discussion about what risk groups, perhaps in terms of countries to which visits have been made and so on, should be referred to. And then 6 lines down, Dr. Cash also expressed concern that the AIDS leaflet was not being taken seriously and supported this with evidence of his own experience as a donor recently. He said directors in Scotland were considering sending a health check letter with every call-up, which would incorporate the details in the AIDS leaflet. So that's the position in 1986. And even into 1989 and 1990, there were further discussions about improvements or changes to either the health questionnaire or to the information provided to donors. I'm not going to look at those now, but if I just give the references, and then we can pick up a new topic after the break. So SBTS 40144003 and SBTS 40189_081 are an exchange of correspondence in December 89 between Dr. Thornton of SNBTS and Dr. Cash about the SNBTS health questionnaire. And then NHBT 40190_063 is a letter in December 1990 from Professor Cash to Dr. Kenneth Coleman, Chief Medical Officer, about the issue of whether donor self-exclusion leaflets did or did not require departmental approval. Dr. Cash's point being that the approval of the Scottish Home and Health Department had not been required for the production of new leaflets, and he said that enabled SNBTS to respond more flexibly, and he was contrasting that with what he said was the position in outside of Scotland, where matters could be held up by the need to seek approval from the Department of Health. Is that a convenient moment at which to take a break? I'm going to move to a slide.
Yes, it is. So we meet again at 5 to 4.
Thank you, sir.
5 to 4.